The sky above the Pacific was a pale grey bruise when dawn broke on June 15, 1944. The horizon shimmered with the faint silhouettes of ships, hundreds of them, an armada so vast that Japanese spotters on saipans cliffs could hardly count them before their radios went dead. The sea was alive with movement, steel hulls grinding against waves, engines churning, and an invisible hum of purpose that carried through the morning mist. The air smelled of salt and diesel, but beneath it lingered the metallic tang of anticipation. American Marines stood shoulder to shoulder on the decks, faces streaked with oil and sweat, silent as they waited for the ramps to drop. Out at sea, the first wave began to form. From the towering transports, dark shapes splashed into the water. Rectangular, ugly, but alive with energy. Landing craft, hundreds of them, pushing out in rows, their blunt hulls slamming against the surf. The Japanese gunners, dug into the coral ridges above, watched in disbelief as the horizon turned into a crawling wall of steel boxes. Each one moved deliberately, unshaken by the pounding artillery that tried to find them. To the defenders it looked impossible. Machines that refused to sink, men that refused to stop coming. Inside the landing craft, the noise was unbearable. Engines roared, gears clanked, and the shouted orders of coxswains echoed over the din. Marines clutched their rifles tight, boots slick with seawater, eyes fixed on the thin slit of daylight ahead. Some muttered silent prayers. Others stared blankly at the floor, feeling the vibration of the engine through their knees. The air was thick with exhaust and fear. When the beach neared, the ramp dropped with a metallic crash and chaos swallowed everything. Machine gun fire ripped across the sand. Shells burst in white fountains around the incoming craft, spraying seawater and shrapnel into the air. Men plunged into the surf, stumbling through waist-deep water as bullets snapped past. But the landing craft behind them didn't stop. Another wave followed, then another. By the time the first Marines reached the dunes, dozens more craft were already churning toward the beach, their flat bottoms gliding over reefs that had once shredded conventional boats. It wasn't luck. It was design. The Americans had brought with them a new kind of weapon, one not made to kill but to deliver war itself. The Japanese command posts reported impossible numbers. Over 2,000 landing craft had appeared off Saipan in less than an hour. The defenders' artillery, once their pride, struggled to target such small, fast-moving shapes. Even direct hits failed to cripple them. Their flat hulls simply rode the shock waves, bouncing back up through the surf. Observers couldn't believe it. In every previous battle, terrain and coral had been nature's allies. Here, nature itself seemed to bow to American engineering. What the Japanese didn't know was that these strange vessels were the product of a revolution hidden far from the front lines. Years earlier, a quiet collaboration between the U.S. Navy and a restless inventor named Andrew Higgins had changed the very nature of amphibious warfare. Higgins had been a boat builder from Louisiana, a man more comfortable with swamp mud than military doctrine. His early designs, flat-bottomed boats made to skim over shallow water, caught the Navy's eye. They could carry men and vehicles straight onto land, eliminating the need for docks or deep harbors. By 1944, his creation had multiplied by the thousands, rolling out of factories that ran day and night. Each boat was stamped with a code, LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel. Marines simply called them Higgins boats. Now on Saipan, those boats were rewriting the rules of invasion. The flat keel and retractable bow ramp turned every stretch of coastline into a potential harbor. Instead of concentrating on a few landing points, the Americans could strike anywhere, anytime, and overwhelm the defense through sheer flexibility. No longer did geography dictate the outcome. The LCVP erased the limits of the map. By mid-morning, the once pristine beaches of Saipan had transformed into industrial chaos. Dozens of landing craft beached side by side, unloading Marines, jeeps, tanks, and crates of ammunition in a rhythm that felt mechanical. Crews worked with ruthless efficiency. Ramps down, cargo out, ramps up, reverse thrust. Within minutes, they were gone, replaced by another wave. Behind the beach, bulldozers roared, clearing sand for supply dumps, while engineers drove stakes for makeshift roads. The Japanese counterfire grew erratic. Their command network was collapsing. Radio lines were cut, artillery spotters lost their bearings, and tanks bogged down in mud as the weight of the invasion pressed inland. A Japanese officer later described the scene as watching the sea give birth to an army. No matter how many boats they destroyed, 10 more seemed to rise from the surf. Their engines coughed, sputtered, but never died. Each carried a handful of Marines drenched and determined, eyes fixed on the smoke ahead. They landed, they fought, and behind them came fuel, rations, bandages, and shells, all ferried by those same squat, unstoppable vessels. The American advance was no longer a line. It was a tide. Commanders aboard the fleet carriers watched through binoculars as the pattern unfolded exactly as planned. For the first time, the U.S. Navy could coordinate land, air, and sea with precision. The landing craft acted as the connective tissue of the operation, linking floating fortresses miles offshore with the chaos of the beach. Without them, the entire invasion would have collapsed under its own weight. With them, it became inevitable. Every few minutes, another LCVP nosed through the surf, dropped its ramp, and disappeared back into the fog, leaving footprints of war on the sand. By afternoon, the beaches of Saipan were littered with debris, burned-out vehicles, shattered helmets, splintered wood, but still, the landing craft kept coming. The sound of their engines became a heartbeat, steady and relentless. Even Japanese snipers began to falter, their bullets wasted on the endless flow of men and metal. The defenders had never imagined an enemy so logistically unstoppable. In their minds, victory had always been tied to courage, to spirit. But what they faced now was something colder, more mechanical, a fusion of will and industry. As night fell, the horizon still burned. Flames from the invasion fleet reflected off the waves, casting an orange glow that danced across the battered hulls of the landing craft, drifting near shore. Crews worked through the darkness, ferrying supplies under the cover of tracer fire. Above them, aircraft circled like sentinels, marking the boundaries of the new beachhead. In less than a day, the Americans had landed tens of thousands of men across terrain once thought impassable. The impossible had become routine, and yet amid the chaos, the true nature of their victory remained unseen. The Japanese commanders, shocked and confused, blamed radar failures, poor coordination, even divine misfortune. None realized that their empire was now facing not just superior firepower, but a system, a machine of war powered by design, engineering, and logistics. The landing craft were merely the visible edge of it. Beneath the surface lay something far greater, something that would soon engulf every island in the Pacific. The Americans had found a way to turn the ocean itself into a weapon. And in the coming battles, that weapon would prove unstoppable. Beneath the victory on Saipan lay a secret not of bravery or luck, but of engineering genius. The heart of the American amphibious assault was not a single weapon, but a machine so deceptively simple that even its creator was dismissed at first as a dreamer. Andrew Higgins, the brash boat builder from New Orleans, had never worn a uniform, but his workshop had given the United States a weapon the Japanese could neither predict nor counter. His flat-bottomed, diesel-driven landing craft, crafted from marine plywood, steel fittings, and the mind of a man obsessed with rivers and mud, became the key to crossing not just oceans, but the boundaries of conventional warfare. The LCVP, as it was officially known, was small, 36 feet long, powered by a 225-horsepower diesel engine, capable of pushing it through rough surf at 9 knots. It carried 36 fully equipped troops or a jeep and its crew, protected by just enough armor to deflect small arms fire. Its genius was not in its firepower or its size, but in its shape. The flat hull let it glide over reefs and shoals that crippled traditional boats. Its retractable bow ramp, lowered by steel cables, turned the front of the craft into a door between sea and land. What had once been a barrier became a pathway. The ocean, once a fortress moat, was now a highway of invasion. On the decks of Saipan and later Tinian, Guam, and Peleliu, these boats performed with a rhythm that no textbook could predict. As one wave of Marines disembarked, another wave was already approaching. Higgins had designed the boats for quick recovery and reuse. Each craft could unload, reverse, and head back for resupply in minutes. Mechanics worked aboard the larger transports in constant rotation, replacing propellers, tuning engines, patching bullet holes. The war had turned into a factory in motion, every component designed to feed the next. This was no coincidence. It was America's greatest weapon. Not a tank, not a plane, but a system of mass production so precise it could turn chaos into choreography. At the center of this machinery stood the Higgins Industries plants of Louisiana. At their peak, they employed more than 20,000 workers, men and women, black and white, welders, carpenters, and engineers, united by the rhythm of saws and hammers. The workers called their boats Marines' taxis, though they knew the truth. These were not mere transports, but the bridges to victory. Each hull was a testament to industrial discipline. Rivets aligned by hand, steel cable tensioned by feel, paint layered to resist the brine of the Pacific. The miracle was not the design alone, but the fact that thousands could be produced, tested, and shipped faster than Japan could destroy them. For the Japanese, the shock was not just tactical, it was psychological. In every pre-war manual, beach defenses relied on one assumption, that the enemy must land where the terrain allowed. They had fortified deep-water beaches, cliffs, and ports, but the LCVP made such logic obsolete. It could land on coral, mud, or sand, and its crews could choose any coastline at any tide. When reports came in of American troops landing in impossible places, Japanese staff officers initially dismissed them as errors. But the pattern repeated from island to island. The ocean no longer protected the empire. It betrayed it. The breakthrough became most visible during the invasion of Tinian in July 1944. The island's beaches were ringed with sharp coral reefs and heavy fortifications. Japanese commanders believed an amphibious landing there was suicidal. American reconnaissance agreed, until a Navy officer noticed a narrow stretch of coastline on the northwest, only yards wide but shielded by reefs that the LCVP could cross. It was a plan that no traditional landing craft could execute. The LCVP, however, thrived on the shallow water. In less than 24 hours, engineers and Seabees marked and cleared the approach lanes. At dawn, hundreds of Higgins boats surged forward. The first waves skimmed over the reefs effortlessly. Japanese guns opened fire, but their shells splashed harmlessly into the shallows. The Marines disembarked directly onto the beach, firing as they ran, while the boats reversed and returned for the next load. Within hours, the Americans had landed thousands of men through an inlet so narrow that Japanese artillery couldn't even depress its barrels low enough to hit them. The defenders' communications broke down almost instantly. By the end of the day, Tinian's supposedly impregnable northern shore was in American hands. What followed was one of the most efficient amphibious assaults in history. Not a single major ship was lost to beach obstacles, and casualty rates were far lower than predicted. Commanders credited coordination, but the real advantage was mechanical. The LCVP's shallow draft had made the impossible possible. When the Japanese realized what had happened, it was too late. Their counterattack never reached the waterline. The Marines had already secured artillery positions inland. Tinian fell in just 9 days. Behind that swift victory was an invisible army of planners, engineers, and shipfitters who had mastered the logistics of war. From Pearl Harbor to Saipan, fleets of landing craft were shipped, assembled, and maintained with obsessive precision. Each LCVP carried spare parts, toolkits, and standardized fittings so any boat could be repaired by any crew. That interchangeability mirrored the broader philosophy of American production, efficiency through standardization. What looked chaotic to the enemy was, in truth, a meticulously designed machine, each component feeding the next in a chain that stretched from the beaches of the Pacific to the factories of the Mississippi. Japanese prisoners later described their disbelief. Some believed the Americans were using secret floating tanks or magic steel that deflected shells. Others spoke of waves that carried soldiers faster than nature should allow. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. The Americans had learned to fuse industry and warfare so tightly that technology itself became a soldier. The LCVP wasn't just a boat. It was the physical manifestation of a doctrine, one where speed, mass, and adaptability mattered more than armor or range. As the war dragged on, this doctrine deepened. New variants of Higgins' design emerged. The LCM for tanks, the LCT for heavy vehicles, and the LST, a behemoth capable of disgorging full divisions directly onto enemy shores. Each owed its lineage to the same simple idea: flatten the hull, drop the ramp, and bring the fight home. Every island taken in the Pacific was another proof of concept. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Leyte. Each one began with the growl of diesel engines and the lowering of steel ramps against the surf. Even in the carnage of battle, the precision of this system stood out. Radio operators synchronized waves of craft with artillery barrages timed to the second. Beachmasters stood waist-deep in water, directing traffic with flags and megaphones as if conducting an orchestra of steel. Behind them, Higgins boats turned in endless loops, delivering men, fuel, and ammunition in a living conveyor belt. The ocean was no longer a barrier. It had become an extension of the supply line. By the time the Japanese High Command understood the scale of what they faced, the tide had already turned. Their own landing craft, limited, fragile, and few, could never replicate the endurance of the American system. Factories in Tokyo could not match the pace of New Orleans. Where Japan built dozens, America built thousands. The empire had been outmaneuvered, not just on the battlefield, but on the blueprint table. When the guns fell silent at Tinian, Marines stood among the wrecks of enemy tanks and the smoking hulks of their own boats. The horizon was littered with debris, but beyond it lay victory. The LCVP had done what no weapon had ever done before. It made the sea itself an ally. And in doing so, it revealed the new face of modern war. One defined not by courage alone, but by invention. But even as the beaches fell quiet, another challenge loomed ahead, one that would test not the machines but the men who kept them running. The tide of war had turned, yet to sustain it would require something even greater than steel or firepower. It would demand endurance, ingenuity, and faith in a system stretched to its limits. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean was no longer a frontier. It was an artery pulsing with American power. Every island seized, every beachhead built, flowed from a rhythm that began in the hulls of Higgins' boats. The Japanese still fought with courage that bordered on fanaticism, but courage could not stop a system that fused engineering, logistics, and human will into one relentless tide. Each new invasion, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, unfolded like a practiced performance perfected through blood. When the order to land came, thousands of engines roared to life in unison. Within minutes, the water near the transports churned white. Then the ramps dropped, and the war came ashore once more. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the beaches of Iwo Jima glowed under volcanic haze. Black sand, hot as ash, swallowed the boots of the first Marines as they stumbled from their landing craft. The air shook with explosions. Smoke rolled low across the water. Japanese artillery had zeroed in on the approach, and waves of Higgins boats vanished in sprays of molten sand and steel. But the rhythm never faltered. For every boat destroyed, another appeared behind it, engines snarling, ramps lowering, men charging through the surf. Even in death, the system endured. Navy engineers worked under fire to clear the beaches, guiding replacement craft through burning wreckage. The invasion line bent, twisted, but never broke. In the command ships offshore, admirals watched the spectacle through binoculars, their faces pale in the reflected fire. They understood what they were witnessing, the perfection of an idea born years earlier in a Louisiana workshop. Each boat, each load of men was a single moving part of a machine now spanning thousands of miles. The fuel that powered those engines had come from tankers in Guam, the ammunition from depots in Hawaii, the steel from mills in Pittsburgh. It was a war fought by entire nations, yet the proof of their unity arrived on every wave of landing craft, slicing toward the shore. For the men who rowed them, the experience was more personal. The thrum of the engine beneath their boots, the spray against their faces, the ramp clanging down. These became the sound and feel of the Pacific War. Many would remember it for the rest of their lives. The claustrophobic darkness inside the boat, the sickly smell of fuel, the momentary silence before the world erupted. The LCVP turned every Marine into part of a ritual of invasion, each landing identical, yet unforgettable. It was an experience shared by more than 1 million men, bound together by the memory of that steel door falling open onto hell. As the Americans advanced from island to island, the Japanese command sank deeper into disbelief. They no longer saw battle as a clash of armies, but as a struggle against inevitability itself. The enemy had found a way to move faster, land harder, and rebuild quicker than nature allowed. Reports from surviving officers told the same story again and again. American landings coming from unexpected directions, overwhelming speed, endless reinforcements. The morale of Japan's defenders began to erode long before their positions were overrun. The psychological shock of facing an opponent who seemed to appear everywhere at once, was devastating. The Empire had built walls of coral and fire, but the ocean no longer obeyed them. Behind every successful landing stood a network of mines and machines that rarely saw the front. Mechanics on repair ships worked around the clock to keep the boats running, replacing worn-out engines, patching hulls, and fabricating parts from scrap metal. Naval engineers revised blueprints mid-campaign, adjusting hull designs to match new beaches. Steelworkers in Louisiana labored through the night, producing hulls faster than submarines could sink them. Women, riveters, and welders, thousands of them, became the quiet architects of victory. Their names never appeared in the headlines, yet each rivet they placed carried another Marine closer to the shore. By Okinawa, the culmination of the Pacific campaign, the system reached its terrifying maturity. More than 200 landing craft participated in the initial assault, forming an iron procession that stretched to the horizon. Over the course of months, they ferried 500,000 men and millions of tons of supplies across open sea under constant attack. Kamikaze raids tore through the fleets. Storms scattered the lines. Yet the machine recovered again and again, adapting faster than it broke. The landing craft became symbols of resilience, ugly, scarred, indestructible. Their flat hulls bore the dents of countless battles, but they floated still, their engines humming like hearts that refused to stop beating. For the Americans, each successful landing carried a cost too heavy to ignore. Beaches gained through ingenuity were paid for in blood. Marines who rowed the Higgins boats into battle often watched their friends fall within seconds of disembarking. Sailors who manned the craft carried those memories long after the war ended. The echoes of gunfire across the surf, the sight of empty ramps returning to the sea. Yet amid that loss, pride endured. They had been part of something larger than themselves, a mechanism of liberation built not on chance, but on design. The Higgins boat had given them the means to fight, and for many the means to survive. When the war finally ended, the beaches of the Pacific fell silent. Rusting landing craft lay abandoned in lagoons and coves, their wooden hulls bleached by the sun. Some were scrapped, others repurposed by fishermen or local traders. But for those who understood their role, they were relics of transformation. The LCVP had changed how humans waged war. It proved that victory was no longer decided by bravery alone, but by coordination, by the invisible threads connecting soldiers, engineers, and machines into one living network. In the cold arithmetic of total war, connection had become the new form of strength. The lessons of that transformation stretched far beyond the Pacific. In the years after 1945, military thinkers across the world studied the American landings with almost religious intensity. They saw how industry, communication, and logistics could amplify combat power beyond imagination. The blueprints of Higgins boats evolved into new generations of amphibious vehicles, bridging tanks and ships, soldiers and satellites. By the time of Korea and Vietnam and later the Gulf War, the idea had matured into doctrine: mobility, coordination, and speed as the ultimate weapons. The same principle that carried Marines onto Saipan now guides unmanned drones and networked fleets across the globe, but the story's heart remains human. Andrew Higgins, who once built swamp boats for lumbermen, died years later with little fanfare. Yet the men who rowed his creations never forgot his name. Many called him the man who won the war for us. Presidents and generals echoed the sentiment. Higgins had not built a weapon in the traditional sense. He had built a bridge between imagination and execution. In his factory's sawdust and diesel fumes lay the future of warfare, a future where the front lines began in the workshop. Looking back, the true power of the Higgins boat was not its steel ramp or diesel engine. It was its philosophy. It represented a belief that complexity could serve simplicity, that the hardest problems of war could be solved by making the path forward as direct as lowering a ramp. The LCVP turned every shoreline into an opportunity, every obstacle into a challenge of design. It embodied a truth that still defines modern warfare: control the flow of movement, and you control the war itself. As veterans returned home and factories fell silent, the world tried to move on. Yet in every museum display, in every grainy photograph of men leaping from steel boxes into chaos, the echo remains. It is the sound of engines straining against the tide, of ramps crashing down, of an idea made flesh through machinery. Those boats carried more than soldiers. They carried the weight of invention, the faith of workers, and the destiny of nations. In the end, history may remember the generals and the battles, but the tide that carried them was built by hands long unseen. The Higgins boat was not glamorous, not beautiful, but it was honest. It was the bridge between sea and land, between fear and courage, between human will and industrial might. It turned the ocean into a road and made the impossible routine, and in the silence after the guns faded, one truth remained clear. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor.